Morning, everybody. Um, it is through Paul's letters, and I know we're talking about James, not Paul, but if you go through Paul's letters, he often talks about demonic as being linked to the powers and the principalities of the world. And the way that they show up is often through structures, systems, societal systems, philosophies, ways of thinking, even cultural norms that actually lead us to take advantage of each other, to manipulate one another, exploit one another, to perpetrate injustice, or to turn a blind eye to injustice. So not necessarily kind of demons acting individually on people, but actually ways in which our whole way of thinking, the whole way a society can think and act, is enslaved by demonic ways. And you're probably thinking, well, I don't know quite what you're saying, so let me give you some examples. In a lot of our societies, it's very common to just think in terms of dog eat dog. It's a dog eat dog world. Or people will say, you just do what you need to do to get ahead. Doesn't matter. Which is all about putting yourself first. Doesn't matter how other people are affected. Okay. What about it's us or them? That is set up to make divisions, that you look at someone else as other, and therefore what they're going through doesn't matter. Or it might mean that you hoard resources because at the end of the day, you got to protect us, don't care about them. How about, it's not hurting anybody. When you do some things, you engage in certain activities that actually you think it's very private, but it has a knock-on impact to lots of other people who could be exploited as a result. Or what about this one that goes all the way back to Cain? I'm not my brother's keeper. That's an easy way to excuse lots of stuff. I'm not my brother's keeper. But if you're sat in this room and you're a follower of Jesus, you're probably thinking, well, actually, I don't think in any of those ways. I've moved on, which is great. But I'll put it to you as well that there's ways in which this pseudo-wisdom still shows up for us. And I'll give you some examples. So there are lots of things that seem good, but aren't necessarily from God. So here's an example from Matthew chapter 16. There's a whole kind of backstory to this, but basically, Jesus has been asking his disciples, well, who do people say that I am? And they say lots of things, John the Baptist, Elijah, lots of people. And then he says, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah. Awesome. And then a few verses later, in the same chapter, Jesus then, he goes on to tell them, well, I'm going to have to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to have to suffer and die. And what's Peter's reaction? Can't happen to you. Can't happen to you. It makes good sense to Peter. If he's the Messiah, he can't die. And Jesus has to say, get behind me, Satan. So, if you put yourself in Peter's place, it seemed good, it seemed sensible, but it wasn't from God. Okay, let me go a little bit further. That's something that seemed good. What about things that seem right, but aren't from God? So what about situations where we are upholding the truth, but the motive behind it isn't so much about truth as it is about uplifting ourselves or maintaining a position or keeping authority? And I want to be really clear about this. Upholding the truth is really important, right? Shouldn't have to say it is really, really important, because it is what we've been entrusted with. We've been entrusted with the gospel. But we also have to be self-aware enough when the way that we uphold the truth isn't always underpinned by absolutely pure motives. So I'll give you an example again. In Jesus' day, and we talk a lot about the Pharisees and Sadducees. I think we give them a bad rap, I have to be honest, because we always say, the Pharisees are super legalistic. Actually, they were super legalistic, but with, in many cases, genuine motives. They wanted to do all the right things in order that the kingdom of God would come. But in doing it, often in part, it wasn't just about doing all the right things that the kingdom of God would come. It would be doing the right things that they could maintain their position in society, their authority over society. And so they were upholding the truth, but in doing that, they missed the one who was the truth, because their motives weren't right, and therefore they couldn't then see who was the truth. What about Paul, the Apostle Paul? So he would say, he was Hebrew of Hebrews, Pharisee of Pharisees, doing absolutely everything right. And he was upholding the truth, even as he was persecuting early Christians, because he believed very zealously what he was doing. But actually, you go behind the motives, and there was a part of it that was about maintaining authority position. You fast forward, again, we think about, it's not been that many centuries, in fact, even in our day, where Christians, Christian communities, the church, we want our societies to function on Christian principles, biblical law. But sometimes the way we go about it is to ally ourselves with political powers, and then the results could be disastrous. And what about also, even in our times, church splits that happen over issues of truth, but actually when you dig behind it, it could be more about a cult of personality. Someone's ego where they need to separate. And actually what that's caused then is disunity, which is not only unhealthy for those in the church, but then the witness to those who are looking on from outside the church is really damaged. Because what they see is the fracture, they don't see the unity. So my point with all those kind of examples is that this pseudo-wisdom doesn't come with like a big red bow or flashing light. It doesn't come and say, right, I am false wisdom, do not listen to me. It would be great if it did, but it doesn't. And I think this is where, kind of going back to the whole strapline of this series, this is where living in really healthy disciple relationships is important, because we need others to help us see what it is that we can't see. So let me go back to that example, the kind of know-it-all person. And some of you pictured someone in your head, right? How many of you pictured yourselves as that person? Possibly someone pictured you. I can imagine someone maybe pictured me. So the whole idea is that we have these blind spots. We're not always able and very self-aware to judge our own motives. But in healthy relationships, other people can help us see. Iron can sharpen iron. People can help us see through to a situation and uncover the real wisdom behind it, and uncover if there are unhealthy motives actually that we're operating from. So, the origins of pseudo-wisdom, they could be subtle, the characteristics may be subtle. What James says, though, is that the effects are ultimately, if not immediately, recognizable, and they're bad. So James talks about disorder and every evil practice arising from the kind of selfish ambitions that underpin this pseudo-wisdom. Now, I don't know, it could be that he's being a little bit dramatic, a little bit, over-exaggerating a little bit to say every evil practice, but the point is made. And without touching too much on James chapter 4, which I know Johnny will cover next week, the kind of disorder, the evil practices were kind of manifesting themselves in factions and dissensions that you'll hear about a little bit more in James 4. And like I say, it still exists in our communities to this day. So this is the first wisdom, pseudo-wisdom. And then James will contrast that with true wisdom. And I will come on to that. I just want to say, this isn't a plug because I don't get any revenue or anything from Netflix, but there is a series on Netflix that if you want to get an idea of just how this kind of thing can play out, it's called Midnight Mass. It's not going to be for everybody because it's a horror series. I don't think it's a spoiler to say it ends in complete carnage, like just carnage. But if you can make it through like the first 6 of the 8 episodes, I'm not saying go binge it this weekend, but if you can make it through the first 6 of 8 episodes, it's a really, really clever plot that it's actually based on what happens when a religious community does stuff based on this kind of pseudo-wisdom with selfish ambition underpinning, and how it can just go really, really wrong. But I say if you don't like blood, don't watch it. Don't watch it. Okay. So then, let's contrast that with true wisdom. Is it working? Yes, thank you. Okay. So by contrast, should go without saying that true wisdom, the origins, are from above. They're from God. So the aims are to glorify God, to act in line with his purposes. And whilst it doesn't say this in James, it's worth pointing out that sometimes the wisdom from God can look really foolish. Like, it can ask us to do things that just seem really foolish to the world. But if God is behind it, we follow. And like pseudo-wisdom, the origins might not be very obvious at the very start, but the effects and the characteristics will be. So just thinking through what the origins and kind of underlying motives are, by contrast with pseudo-wisdom, true wisdom has pure motives, unselfish, God-honoring motives. And what is it characterized by? So I'm going to read out a list of traits. I mean, some of them, all of them are on here from the NIV, but I'm also going to read from the NLT and from the Message. So from the NIV, we have here peace-loving, considerate, submissive. It says impartial, sincere. Probably in your translations, it talks about full of mercy and good fruit as well. The NLT puts it as, New Living Translation puts it as peace-living, gentle at all times, willing to yield to others, full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds, shows no favoritism, and always sincere. And in the Message, I think even more helpfully, puts it as getting along with others, gentle and reasonable, overflowing with mercy and blessings, not hot one day, cold the next, and not two-faced. So as you're listening to those, I'm hoping it jogs in your memory, or it may sound familiar, some of these characteristics. And if this works, there you go. A lot of them should sound very much like the Beatitudes. So I've written out here, or you've got on the slide, pretty much all the Beatitudes, except I haven't finished off the phrasing of the last one because I ran out of slide. But basically the ones that correspond very much to what we've just read are the ones that are highlighted. So, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. and blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And if you've ever studied the Beatitudes, you'll know that what they're kind of markers that Jesus says will characterize the people of the new creation, of the new kingdom that is, it's the now but not yet. It's not fully operational. These are the markers of the transformed humans that we will be, who will rule and reign with God when heaven and earth are reunited. When we pick up our kind of original vocation from Genesis 1 and 2. So what James is doing is he's riffing on what Jesus was saying in the Beatitudes. So like if we combine what Jesus explicitly said in the Beatitudes and what James is saying now, some questions. How should our lives demonstrate this true wisdom with these characteristics? So I'll say, first of all, it starts with purity of our motives. So by contrast with operating under selfish ambition, it's now about really and truly following what James previously called the royal law, which is to love God and to love neighbors as ourselves. And this isn't easy. I'm sure all of you will say it's not easy. We know it here. It's harder to kind of put into practice. And this is the reason why we need God to search us out and to highlight what's really inside of us. So, there's the bit in Psalm 139, verses 23, 24, it says, Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me, know my anxious thoughts. See if there's anything that's offensive in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. And then Psalm 51 kind of builds on that, and it says, because it recognizes that where we are, our hearts aren't naturally inclined to do these things. And it says, 51 verse 10, create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. So that's the first thing, starting with the purity of our motives. And then how that translates, so thinking about your relationships, it's about, when we act with true wisdom, it's about being prepared to set aside our own kind of rights, our own entitlements, in order that we can uplift others. And you think about, how Jesus operated throughout his whole kind of life, his whole ministry. That's what Jesus did. The passage in Philippians tells us that he gave up everything that he had, all his status, power, glory, to come down and be one of us, and not just to be one of us, but to be a servant to us. And the things that he did that demonstrate this, washing the disciples' feet. Something so practical, so humbling. He served them. And then on top of that, he served us by taking on the death that we should have. He served us. And, going back to what it says in James chapter 3, when it talks about acting in the humility that comes from wisdom, that's what that is, that meekness. It's knowing the power that we have, but being able to put it aside in order to lift others up, in order to glorify God. And above everything else, it's about seeking peace. It's about peacemaking, which is a very active thing. It's not passive at all. Peacemaking. And what does peacemaking involve? Well, lots of things, but it requires us to be forgiving and merciful in the same way that we were shown mercy and forgiven. It requires us to not only think about ourselves, but to think about what conditions need to be to promote kind of right relationships, to promote the flourishing of other people. Because one thing, we have this word righteousness, and I don't know about you, but oftentimes, for a long time, when I used to think about this word righteousness, I would think very much only in terms of the kind of vertical relationship with God. But actually, when you read the Old Testament, it's this way and it's that way as well. It's about the relationships with other people as well. And in fact, righteousness and justice are words that are very synonymous throughout the Old Testament, also in the Gospels. What else does peacemaking involve? Like, from a practical perspective, sometimes it requires us to step out of situations, just to not add more fuel to a fire. Yeah. Some of you can picture situations where someone just keeps coming back at you. They just and sometimes you just have to remove yourselves. There's a danger sometimes in removing yourselves too quickly from situations and just checking out before actually resolving something. So there's wisdom in that. Sometimes it requires us to stay in situations, but in doing so, to put aside our entitlements, our rights, sometimes just even putting aside that knowledge that we are right. How many times you've been in an argument and you know you're right? you know it. But you sometimes have to kind of put that aside in order to seek peace with the other person. And I want to be really clear here that when I'm talking about staying in these kind of situations, I'm not talking about any situations of abuse. So I'm not talking about where it's physical, emotional, spiritual abuse. That's a whole different thing. But I'm talking about situations where there is the possibility for peace, and sometimes we just have to put ourselves down in order to seek that peace. Sometimes it requires us to go further and to think about situations that we're not even actively involved in, but where we can advocate on behalf of others. Voices that might be suppressed, or voices that are, where people are suffering injustice. And if you read through the Old Testament, it is really clear, God makes it really clear, there's kind of 4 categories that he holds really dear to his heart. He talks about the widow, the fatherless, the foreigner, and the poor. So much so that we call them the quartet of the vulnerable. Because if you think about biblical times, they're the people who were marginalized, who were at the edge of society. And God had a really special heart for them. And sometimes peacemaking means that we have to advocate for them. Now, if we translate it to now, it's not going to be the exact same categories. So, maybe a thought experiment for you. Who would it be in our day who would fall into that category? And how can we act on their behalf? So I think with all this, it is really critical, as you'll see, that we need God's wisdom to know what to do, which approaches to follow, and when. And the good news, because it's good news, is if you go all the way back to James 1-5, it says that if we ask for God's wisdom, he gives it generously. He's not stingy. If we ask for God's wisdom, he will give it. So that's something I hold on to, because none of these situations is easy. And the promise, then, is that if we do employ God's true wisdom, the promise of James 3:18 is that we will reap a harvest of righteousness. And what might that look like? So I think that what that looks like is communities, societies where there is kind of true shalom. Everything is right and everything is at peace. And what that is then is for us a foretaste of what will come in the next age when heaven and earth are united. And it's not only good news for us, then it's good news for everyone who's looking in at those communities. Because they look in and go, we want a piece of that. We want a part of that. And before you say to me, well, it's all well and good, James is talking theory. James is not just talking theory, because James had to do this. James had to do this very thing. If you go back to Acts chapter 15, James was one of the people at the forefront when Gentiles were being welcomed en masse to the church, or the early Christian communities, which at that point were largely Jewish and Torah observant. And there was these questions, well, on what terms do they come in? What do they have to observe? How do we get things, how do we make them fit? And it was James, acting with God's wisdom, who was able to say, right, this is how we do it. And this is how we will make sure that God's agenda is fulfilled, that the church is open to everyone. All are welcome, all are loved, and the unity of the church is preserved. So James had to do the thing. He's not just talking theoretically. So I'm gonna close. And just in closing, I'm just gonna remind us what it is that James is calling us to do. So he's calling us to live wisely, not just talk the talk, but do the thing. And in living wisely, he's saying specifically not to live by this pseudo-wisdom, that's earthly, unspiritual, demonic, that has at its root selfish ambition and self-gratification, and which ultimately is going to lead to disorder and factions and disunity. But instead, to live by the true wisdom of God that comes from pure, God-centered motives and that actively cultivates peace. And I think you can agree with me, when we look around this world, we need peace. Lord, we need peace. You look at all the conflicts all around. So whether it's Gaza, Sudan, Congo, Ukraine, we need peace. And what we see instead sometimes is our leaders feeding the war machine. We need peace. If we bring it a little bit nearer to home, national level, we've got a general election coming up. Now, the conversations that people are going to have over the next 6 weeks are not necessarily going to be very gratifying. We need peace. If we bring it down to a personal level, we could think about the neighbor who gets on our nerves. We could think about the work colleague that we don't see eye to eye with. We might think about the spouse or the partner or the child or the parent that we're currently having a little bit of friction with. We need peace. And I think it would be absolutely awesome if everyone around us, friends, colleagues, neighbors, the world, could actually look in on us and our communities and see a different story than what they see otherwise, if they see a story of peace and reconciliation.